Our Bible reading today comes from the Old Testament book of Habakkuk. Not a very familiar book perhaps, but the writings are by the prophet Habakkuk, and they come from near the end of the 7th century BC. At that time, the Babylonians were in control of much of the old world, and they were a particularly cruel country in control of places such as Israel. Now, Habakkuk was greatly disturbed by all the violence carried out by the Babylonians and asked the Lord for help. And so in chapter 1, we're reading verses 1 to 4. Habakkuk is crying out to the Lord. Lord, how long do I have to cry out for help before you listen? How many times do I have to yell, help, murder, police, before you come to the rescue? Why do you force me to look at evil, stare trouble in the face day after day? Anarchy and violence break out, quarrels and fights all over the place. Law and order fall to pieces. Justice is a joke. The wicked have the righteous hamstrung and stand justice on its head. I'm actually reading from the Message Bible if you are following it, but you will get the similar words in the copies that you have. The second reading comes from chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, and here we have God's reply. And then God answered, Write this what you see. Write it out in big block letters so that it can be read on the run. This vision message is a witness pointing to what's coming. It aches for the coming. It can hardly wait, and it doesn't lie. If it seems slow in coming, wait. It's on its way. It will come right on time. Look at that man bloated by self-importance, full of himself, but soul empty. But the person is right standing before God. Through loyal and steady believing is fully alive, really alive. And then in chapter 3, verses 17 and 19, though the cherry trees don't blossom and the strawberries don't ripen, though the apples are worm-eaten and the wheat fields stunted, though the sheep pens are sheepless and the cattle barns empty, I'm singing joyful praise to God. I'm turning cartwheels of joy to my Saviour God. Counting on God's rule to prevail, I take heart and gain strength. I run like a deer. I feel like I'm king of the mountain. This is the word of the Lord.
And for the next few weeks, I'm just going to do a short thematic series on this subject of waiting on God even when things are difficult. So it will be looking at some of the passages in the scriptures which deal with patience and waiting on God through hard times. And of course, the letter or the poem written here by the prophet Habakkuk is typical of that sort of thing. And the way that Christian faith is sometimes communicated, both explicitly and implicitly, you could get this idea that if you really trust in God, that you'll be preserved from all ills. Now, we all know that's not true. And that's certainly what this letter is dealing with. Sorry, I keep calling it a letter, it's a poem. It's a poetic way of putting forward this prophecy. Sometimes what prophets would do is they would get a word from God, and then they would sit down and they would write it out in such a way as to communicate it artistically, often with poetry. Sometimes they did it actually play acted. You could see times when Isaiah, for instance, wandered around with his bear behind. Mary had a little bear to which she was so kind. And everywhere that Mary went, you could see her bear behind. Never heard that before? Okay. Probably not appropriate for a Sunday morning. I don't know where that came from. But Isaiah would actually wander around with his buttocks exposed as a prophetic plant. Did you know that? Well, he did. So that's why that poem was read out. Anyway, the point was here, what he was showing was that the nakedness of Israel will be one day exposed, and he was acting that out. And so the way that prophets communicated wasn't just, they wouldn't just stand up on a street corner and say, "Thus saith the Lord," but rather they would write it out. And this is one of these written prophecies. It was written as a poetic, artistic way of representing the word that came from God. And it wasn't just in his private journal either. This was a way of communicating with the rest of Israel, and then it was circulated around the towns and villages and Jerusalem and so on, as a way of saying, look, hear what God is saying, see what's going on. And keep in mind also that Habakkuk was only one of many prophets at the time, and he was a contemporary of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, of course, wrote a lot more than Habakkuk, and sometimes the prophets would actually collude together and work out what was going on and how to communicate and all this sort of thing. And so what Habakkuk is doing is saying, in spite of everything that's going on in the world around you, and in spite of what's going on in our own country, know this, that God is still in control. That's the most important thing to take away from all of this. In fact, I like to say that Habakkuk is the Reader's Digest version of the book of the Revelation. The whole book of the Revelation deals with exactly the same sort of thing that Habakkuk does. But of course, the book of the Revelation is a long, very complicated book. It would probably take us all year to go verse by verse through the book of the Revelation. I'm going to spare you from that. So we're going to get a one-week version of the book of Revelation in this shorter version of that same message in Habakkuk. In fact, you could even take it right down to one verse, the verse that Jesus said in John 16, where he said, "In this world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." That's the one-sentence summary of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is the shorter version of the message that comes through the book of the Revelation. They all saying the same thing. And I think it's good for us to remind ourselves that even when things don't seem to be going well, that God is still in control, that he is sitting on the throne, that he still has this thing under control. Anyway, that being said, you know, when I was a small child in church, I sort of had this message came to me that if you really believe in Jesus, your life will go well. It will be happy days. And for those who don't believe, not so happy. Well, as I grew a little bit older, I think I was about 7.5 when I realised that's not true. And yet I would look at verses like, say, John 10:10, which at first glance seems to indicate that faith equals happy days. You know, in John 10:10 it says that the thief comes to kill and to steal and destroy, and the thief that he's talking about there is not Satan, by the way. It was the false teachers, the Pharisees and so on. And he says they come and they steal from you, and they come to kill, steal and destroy. But I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And I heard messages on that passage that would say if you really believe in Jesus, you'll have a more abundant life and everything will be happy days. And then I got to a point where I thought, well, if this is life and life more abundantly, everyone else must be having a horrible time. Do you know what I'm saying? But of course, we misunderstand what Jesus is saying there, and it's really important we get to right down into it, because abundant life must be measured on some other scale other than merely health, wealth and happiness. And that's not what Jesus was talking about when he said abundant life. In fact, the key word here is life, which is, in the Greek, is Zoe, the life of God. He's not talking about biological life, and he's not just talking about the normal indicators that we would say if someone's going well or not. You know, people would say you're going well because you've got a big bank account, because everything's going your way, and you're healthy and happy. But that's not what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about abundant life there. Those things come and go. I mean, the word haps, where we get the word happy from, actually literally means luck. So you're happy some days, and other days you're not. That's just lucky. You know, I got up this morning and the sun was shining and I was in a happy mood. I still am. And that's just lucky me. But tomorrow, maybe not. But that's not how you measure life. Jesus isn't talking about that kind of thing. The abundant life he's talking about here is the life of God. The person who trusts in God will have this Zoe life, which is a life which is above and beyond and is unaffected by the haps of this life, whether good or bad. And there's something else that sustains you and keeps you going when things are good and when things are bad. It really makes no difference. That nothing, as we sang before, nothing separates us from the love of God. And because of that, when things are going bad, you're still loved. When things are going well, you're loved just the same. You're not loved because things are going well. I actually turned the TV on this morning and there was a preacher on there who was basically saying that if things are going well, then that shows that God loves you. And I thought, well, this is not helping me. Not what I'm about to preach anyway. So let's keep in mind that when Jesus is talking about abundant life, he's talking about the life that is in God and comes from God, the Zoe life, not biological life, but something which is above and beyond the circumstances of life. And so Zoe life can only be understood and valued from the point of view of faith. You know, a life worth living, no matter what the circumstances of the biological life may be. I remember seeing a meme on Facebook once, and this to me describes what it is like to be a real believer. And there was an ad for a lost dog, and it said, lost dog, three-legged, missing one ear, bent tail, recently dissexed, answers to the name Lucky. And in a sense, that's what you ought to be able to say about a believer, is that no matter what's going on in their life, somehow or another they still count themselves blessed. And can you really say that? Can you really say, I'm blessed? Even when you get up and you've got pain in your body, you've got difficult circumstances, and everything seems to be going sideways, and yet what Jesus is saying is that I've come that you might have that kind of a life. And he wasn't promising you, you know, a bed of roses. I mean, look at the life of Jesus himself. I mean, he wasn't hovering above suffering. He was immersed in it. And the book of Hebrews says that through the things that Jesus suffered, he was brought to perfection. Not that he became better through his suffering, but rather he reached the goal of overcoming sin and death on our behalf. But the only way to get there was to go through the crucible of suffering to get there. And he reached the goal. That's what the word perfection means, getting to a goal. And so, I mean, Jesus was all his, I've said it before, that King Herod tried to murder him when he was 2. And his family was in exile. And then later in life, of course, his earthly father died when he was probably quite young, had to look after the family business. He was betrayed by his friends and murdered by the state. So, and yet Jesus is saying, I've come that you might have life and life more abundantly. And let's not forget that every single one of the apostles, except for one of them, was murdered. It was only John who managed to escape that, but he spent time in prison. So there's something else that's going on that Jesus is talking about here, and which I believe we can find here in this story of Habakkuk. Now let's give a little bit of context here. What was going on at the time was Habakkuk was looking at what was going on in Israel, and he was appalled about what was going on in the nation of Israel. People were giving way to all kinds of licentiousness and corruption, and as Graham read out of the Message translation, to put it in pretty colourful kind of language, Things are just a mess. The rule of law is broken down. Everything's falling apart. But the reason that this was happening was because of outside pressures. At the time, Israel was trying to protect itself from invaders. The northern kingdom had already been taken into exile and essentially destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was one of the most cruel, most horrible empires you can possibly imagine. They loved torture. They used psychological warfare. They were just the worst of the worst. And they had destroyed the northern half of Israel. In fact, they took them out, when they took them into exile, they broke them up into smaller groups and then put them out into other nations that they had overtaken so that they would interbreed with the other nations, and then also give up their worship of God and start worshipping other gods. And that way it was a way of breaking down their social identity. They were trying to destroy them from the inside out. And of course, those who did survive that eventually came back to the northern kingdom, and they were called Samaritans. And that's why the real, the more pure Jews looked at the Samaritans as being second class and viewed them pejoratively. So that had already happened. And then Babylon was on the rise. They had destroyed Syria, and they were looking territory hungry, and they were looking towards Israel and were going to take over Israel. And so everyone was worried about that. And so they turned to their old enemies, Egypt, and had an alliance with Egypt in the hope that Egypt would, by having a pact with them, that they would then be able to defend them against the Babylonians. But the Egyptians went and fought against Babylon, and they were routed and sent packing back to Egypt, and their army had been destroyed. And so there was Israel, like a perch, like a rock on a perch? No, like a shag on a rock, all by them lonesome, no one to come to their aid, and Babylon was warmongering and beginning to say that they were going to take over Israel. Now, you would think that would be a perfect time to put your faith in God, but that's not what happened. What Israel did was they started to worship the gods of Babylon in the hope that the God of Babylon would treat them well. So they were giving away their faith, giving away their birthright. And before that, some of them had been worshipping the gods of Egypt in the hope that the gods of Egypt would help Egypt to prevail against Babylon. And then when that failed, they swapped that over for the gods of Babylon and started worshipping the gods of Babylon. And this is what Habakkuk is seeing. And he's seeing this going on in Jerusalem, in the very heartland, and he's saying, what is going on? We've lost it. Everything's going wrong. And so he says, how long, Lord, must I call for help? But you don't seem to be listening. And I cry out to violence, but you do not save. And why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralysed and justice never prevails, and the wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. So he's looking at Israel. He's talking about Israel here. He's saying, we're falling apart. We're fighting against one another. There are allegiances being created with the gods of other nations, and people have given up looking at the law. They don't care about their faith in you anymore, and they're fighting against one another. And everyone's trying to get ahead and trying to make themselves have an alliance with these other nations. And so he's waiting for God to give him an answer to his complaint. Have you ever complained to God? We all have. Well, God, I believe in you, and this is happening in my life. What's going on? I've been tempted to say that occasionally. So God replies in verse 5. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but this is what God says when he replies. He says, you'll be pleased to know that I am doing something. And I can imagine Habakkuk is thinking, well, that's a relief. It's about time you did something. It's been a little bit long, and you've been letting this go for too long. So what are you going to do? And then he explains to Habakkuk that he's going to raise up the Babylonian army and he's going to cause them to invade Israel and take them into exile. And of course, Habakkuk's not well pleased with this. He's thinking, sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you repeat that to me? And God makes it clear that he is going to do something that would amaze him if he could really understand what was going on. And so here we see a clash between the expectations of Habakkuk and the reality that he gets and the answer he gets from God. And things are certainly not looking all that good. It reminds me of an old story I heard about an old monk who had a horse that he used to use for tilling his vegetable garden. And one day, his horse escaped into the hills, which meant that he was going to be left destitute, not able to till his soil and produce vegetables for that year. And so all the villagers in the village came together around him and said, "Oh, what terrible bad luck. Nothing's working out for you. You've lost your horse." But the old monk had been around for long enough and he said, "Maybe it's good luck, maybe it's bad luck. Who knows? We'll see." And then a little later, his son set out to see if he could find the horse up in the hills. And not only did he find the horse, but the horse had gathered together a whole herd of wild horses, and he was able to bring them all back in and pen them. And so all the villagers came to the old monk and they said, "What good luck. You've just got yourself a really good windfall, a whole bunch of horses that you'll be able to sell." And the old monk said, "Good luck, bad luck, who knows? We'll see." And then his son was breaking these horses in and to make them more sellable. And one of the horses threw him and he broke his leg. So all the villagers came and said, "Oh, what terrible bad luck. Your son broke his leg." And the old monk said, "Good luck, bad luck, who knows? We'll see." And then the next day, the army marched into the land and forced every able-bodied man to fight in a bloody war with the neighbouring kingdom. And all the neighbours gathered and said, "What good luck that your son broke his leg and couldn't go to war." And the old monk said, "Good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And I think there's something in that you can't measure the circumstances of life just by the immediate outcomes that it might seem to have for your life. And that's what Habakkuk is having to learn, is that the invasion of Babylon, it might seem like a really bad thing. But maybe it's not. Maybe there's something else going on. There's a bigger picture here that we can't quite see. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, who knows? And so he's having to look beyond the immediate circumstances and say something else is going on. And certainly there are many cases in the scriptures where people have had to deal with exactly this kind of thing in many places. Of course, we looked at how the disciples of Jesus had a similar experience at the crucifixion. You know, they were thinking everything was going really well. Jesus is on the rise and rise and rise. A perfect, the raising of Lazarus from the dead and the healing of the blind, all the signs and wonders that Jesus did as he came into Jerusalem on the wave of popular support, looking like he was about to set up the kingdom of God, and then he gets crucified, and they were utterly dismayed and thought it had all gone terribly wrong. But then things change. But the problem is both our expectations and reality are poor guides to the truth. Just because circumstances seem to be pointing in one way or another, and just because our expectations may be in one way or another, both of those need to be put to one side, because neither of them is entirely to be trusted. One overrates, the other one underrates. But the life that God wants us to know cannot be framed by either our wishes or even by the circumstances of our life. And I think this is the thing that Habakkuk had to come to see. He had to come to see that, I can't believe you would do this, that you would bring a nation more evil than even Israel in its most corrupt state. You're going to bring a more evil nation to invade us and to undo the evil that's in our nation. How could it be that you could let this happen? In fact, in Verse 13, he says in chapter 1, "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous?" And he's talking about Babylon there. Now that's a verse that's often quoted out of context, saying, "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil." And people say that God can't, he gets squeamish when he's around evil, and he just can't look at it. God's not squeamish, in case you hadn't wondered. I mean, Jesus Christ came, he is God in the flesh. He came and he dwelt in this broken, sinful world, and he was never squeamish around evil. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is God is so pure that he can't look at evil and do nothing about it. God will restore things, renew them, and change them. That's really what he's saying. But what he's saying is, how could you let someone more evil than Israel come and teach us a lesson? That doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem appropriate. So then that brings us to chapter 2, where Habakkuk takes a stand. And he says, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer he will give to my complaint." In other words, Habakkuk's going, "All right then, God, I've explained to you how you're wrong, so give me an answer that's satisfying." And he's crossing his arms almost. Can you imagine it? We've all done this, I'm sure. And then God gives his reply. And he says, "Write down the revelation, make it plain on tablets, so that the herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come, and it will not delay." So what's he saying there? What I believe he is saying there is that justice is coming eventually. So write it down and let everyone know that even though it lingers, even though it takes some time to come to pass, it will come to pass, and justice will one day be done. And never forget that. Justice will one day be done. It may not even happen in your lifetime, but justice is coming. When Jesus returns, justice will be fully done. And even before then, there are days of justice that come. There is a correcting of the wrongs that go along all through history, but at the very least we can say, no matter what else is going on, God will still be just and prove himself just in the long term. That's what the book of the Revelation is all about. That's what Jesus pointed to his disciples. That's what God is saying here to Habakkuk. He's saying, write this down so that everyone can know it. Put it out there, publish it for the nations to read. Make it plain on tablets. Get your messengers to go through the land and let everyone know that even though it seems like it's taking a long time for justice to be done, justice will be done. Make no mistake about it. And then he goes on in verse 4, and this is probably the key verse of the whole book of Habakkuk. It's quoted at least twice elsewhere in the scriptures. It says, "See, the enemy is puffed up." He's talking about Babylon there. "He desires what is not right. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness," or live by faith, as it has it in the older translations. The just shall live by faith. In other words, they won't just live by what they see. They won't just live by the circumstances that surround them or by their expectations. They will see past all of that, and they will see long term into the future, and they will see that justice will be done. One day it's going to be done. And in fact, as the Message translation had it, which I thought was interesting because it correlates with what Jesus said in John 10:10. "But the person in right standing before God, through loyal and steady believing, is fully alive." Really alive. Can you see that? That's exactly what Jesus said. He said, "I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." And again, he's not talking about the things of this material world. He's saying you'll have the Zoe life, the life of God. Something will get deep inside of you that will be more valuable than anything else you could possibly have. And that's what he's saying here to Habakkuk, that the person who trusts in me, the person who just simply believes, they will be really, really alive. And even contrast that with, the person who's puffed up, they seem to have it all. It's all going their way. In their corruption, they have made a lot of wealth, but in the end, they really have nothing. But the person who trusts in God, they're the ones who have something which is even more valuable. I heard it once said that hope is a good thing, perhaps the best of things. And I sometimes have to say, absolutely, hope is more important than a big bank account. Hope is more important than anything else. Hope outlasts even death. And that kind of hope comes through trusting in God and believing in what He is going to do in the long term. So, and of course, Paul quotes this very verse in his exposition of the book of Romans, saying that for in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, even as it has been written, but the just shall live by faith. So Paul himself is understanding this passage in that kind of way, but he's applying it to his context and saying that those who believe will be the gospel reveals the righteousness of God from faith to faith. In other words, by believing what we hear in the gospel, it gives us that hope, it gives us a real life, which gives us the same kind of thing that the believers in Habakkuk's time would have, that carries us through the worst of times. In other words, God's faithfulness to His covenant is what carves out space for and shapes our own faith. We are given additional information that supersedes the reality we live in and our wishful thinking. We live in a life framed by faith that sees the longer, bigger plan of God, and by this, we really live. Does that make sense? And so, at the end of chapter 2, in verse 20, and I'm skipping over a whole bunch of stuff here, but in verse 20, he says, this is God speaking to Habakkuk and saying, the Lord is in His temple, let all the earth be silent before Him. Or if I was to put that in a more contemporary language, he said, God is on the throne, all the world shut up. All these voices, the voices of the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the corrupt Israelites. He's saying they're all wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. God is on His throne. And all these other voices, and of course this is so applicable to the church right here and now in the West, where we are living, I think, in the West, in a very tumultuous time for the church. And I think the church is in a very similar position as Israel was. We're surrounded by all these strong voices that seem to be taking the ascendancy. And many believers are quitting the faith, or they're becoming cold, or they're compromising their faith in ways that sort of make them look a little bit more pleasing to the world around them. But the current circumstances are going to pass. And the political state of things will change. And the voices that seem to be the loudest at the moment will be silenced. And justice will be done one day. And by justice, I mean God's good plan for the earth will eventually be fully accomplished. And we have the hope of that grounded in us by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, in which we see the foretaste of things to come. The resurrected body of Jesus Christ is kind of a preview of what's going to happen to your physical body one day and what's going to happen to the physical earth one day when everything will be restored and God's justice will be done. And though it linger, though it takes time, wait for it. It will surely come. Don't give up your hope. Don't compromise your faith. Just because everyone speaks differently or even ridicules you for it, in the end, people are going to see that God is in his temple and all the earth will be made silent before him. And it's at this point that Habakkuk begins to see what's really going on. Habakkuk is therefore able to have joy despite the fact that Israel is being overrun by enemies and that it's compromised and corrupt in its own state. But nothing ultimately stands in the way of God's ultimate plans in creation. Like red gums on an outback river, a person of faith is unfazed by the vagaries of the seasons and the droughts and the floods as they come and go. If you were to go out into outback Australia right now, it's a great year to go to outback Australia, by the way. We've had 2 good years of rain, and there's knee-deep vegetation everywhere you go. What would normally be Gibber Plains and desert is covered in vegetation. There are flocks of budgies and zebra finches that are so huge they're annoying. But 3 years ago, you would have been at the end of about 5 years of serious drought, and it was like the surface of the moon. But when you go to the creeks, there's these big red gums. When it's flooded, there's these big red gums, and when it's drought, there's these big red gums. All the other vegetation comes and goes. But the big red gums are tapped into something so deep that it doesn't matter whether there's a drought or a flood. It doesn't change anything for them. They just keep on going on hundreds of years through all of the comings and goings of the weather. People talk about this weather is unprecedented. It's like unprecedented was used in an unprecedented manner last year. Because it's not true. It's totally precedented. Everything's precedented. Nothing's different than it's ever been. Floods and droughts have come. There was a 1,000-year drought at one stage in Australia's history, apparently. But the point is that if we're tapped into something deeper, then the vagaries of what's going on in the culture and in history and even in our own circumstances can be put to one side. And the person of faith will really live, no matter what else is going on. So in the end, Habakkuk says that even though the fig tree does not flourish, even though there's no fruit on the vines, and the olive crop fails, and the fields yield no food, and the flocks be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet will I rejoice in the Lord. What he's saying is, even though there's been economic disaster take place because of the invasion of the Babylonians, I know that that's not the end of the story. There's something bigger going on. In the end, God will prove himself faithful, and he will do as he's promised. But sometimes we have to wait. If it seems slow in coming, wait. It's on its way, and it will come right on time. Amen.